My name is Kate Morgan. I'm 42 years old, a tech entrepreneur most of my relatives never really paid attention to. People saw the Morgans as flawless, but I knew even then that our glass house was already cracking. I grew up in a family that looked perfect from the outside. We had a large house with trimmed hedges and polished windows, family photos with matching outfits, smiles that looked natural enough to pass. At church or school events, people whispered that my parents had done everything right. My father, Charles, was respected. My mother, Eleanor, was admired. My sisters were adored. And me, well, I was there too, though most people barely noticed. My father lived for order and control. He praised appearances, not questions. Madison, my older sister, carried herself like a pageant queen, always ready to please him. Chloe, the youngest, had soft curls and a sweet smile that melted his stern face. I remember sitting at the dinner table listening to him lift his glass to celebrate Chloe's piano recital or Madison's new dress. The laughter that followed seemed warm, but it never reached me. My own news, my small victories seemed to vanish before they left my mouth. I was different. By the time I was 10, I could already write code simple enough to make a program that tracked chores in the house. It was clunky, but it worked. I imagined my father's face lighting up, imagined him placing his hand on my shoulder and calling me clever, even valuable. That night, I printed out pages of what I had built, and I carried them to his study as if I was carrying proof that I belonged. The room smelled faintly of his scotch. He was sitting with a ledger open in front of him, lines of numbers and neat columns. I stepped closer and held out my work. I explained in careful words how the system could save time, how it could help the family business one day. He barely glanced at the pages. He took them, held them between his fingers, and then dropped them onto the desk as if they weighed nothing. His voice was calm but cold. He said, "Do not mistake little projects for real business. Do not think being clever makes you more valuable than your sisters. Life is not about being the smartest in the room. It is about being useful. And frankly, I do not see where you fit." The words landed heavier than the papers themselves. My cheeks burned, but I nodded just as he expected. I wanted to ask why I wanted to push back, but I had already learned that questioning him only made things worse. So I stayed quiet. My mother was sitting in a chair by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She smoothed her dress with one hand, but never spoke. Not a word. I looked at her, hoping for some sign that she saw me, that she cared, but her eyes stayed down. That silence cut deeper than my father's dismissal. Later that night, I sat in my room staring at the papers I had gathered back up. I wrote myself a small note in the margin. If Dad likes this, maybe he will be proud of me. I left it there, but I did not know that my mother would find it. She never showed me then, but years later I learned she had tucked that note into a jewelry box, hidden away. It meant that even in her silence she had noticed. At the time, though, I felt only emptiness. That was the night I began to understand the rules of our house. Some children were chosen to shine, to be held up as proof of perfection. Others were not. My sisters were praised for their beauty, their charm, their sweetness. I was told that my questions were noise, my ideas were distractions. I learned to hide the excitement I felt when solving a problem. I learned to keep my words close because they were not welcome at the table. Still, I kept building. I filled notebooks with ideas. I stayed up late to study textbooks that were far too advanced for my age. My mind raced with possibilities, but my heart grew heavy each time I faced my family. It is a lonely thing to be the invisible one, especially when you are standing in a room full of people who claim to love you. Looking back now, I can see how those moments shaped me. The praise I never received, the silence I could not break the weight of always being overlooked. That was the beginning of the fracture. That was when I realized that brilliance would never buy me a seat at our table. Our glass house gleamed for the world to see, but inside it I was already fading into the shadows. And so, while everyone else carried on with their smiles and their celebrations, I carried something else inside me. A growing certainty that if I wanted to be seen, I would have to find another way. That thought stayed with me through my early teenage years, and I clung to it like a secret. My father's rejection in his study had stung, but I told myself that if he would not look at me, maybe my mother would. Every child, no matter how strong, still longs for a mother to say, "I see you. I believe in you." I thought if I could just reach her heart, perhaps the silence around me would finally break. Not long after I built another small program, this one designed to track supplies for the company. I imagined how it could save time, reduce waste, even help his managers. I brought it to my father again, standing straighter this time, hoping that persistence would win him over. He barely looked at it before dismissing me with the same cold tone. He said, "Not as useful as what your sisters bring to this family." I froze in place, the words pressing down like a weight I could not lift. He returned to his ledger as though I were no more than a shadow at his door. That night, I sat alone at my desk holding the papers he had discarded. For the first time, I felt a deep ache in my chest, heavier than before. I needed someone to tell me I mattered, and I thought of my mother. She was softer, more gentle. She never raised her voice, and I remembered the way she smoothed her hands over tablecloths, as if calm could erase tension. I told myself that beneath her quiet exterior, she must care, and maybe if I gave her the right words, she would show it. So I took out a piece of paper and began to write. It was not a project this time, not a design or a plan, but a letter from the heart. I wrote that I did not hate her, but I did not understand why she never spoke up for me. I wrote that I was scared of never belonging in this family. I asked her if she had ever believed in me the way she believed in Madison and Chloe. The words spilled out awkward and raw, but honest. By the time I finished, my hand was cramped and my eyes were burning, but I felt lighter, as if I had finally spoken what I could not say aloud. I folded the letter carefully and slid it onto her vanity where I knew she would find it. Then I waited. A day passed, then 2, then a week. No reply came. She never mentioned the letter. She looked at me with the same calm eyes. At breakfast smoothed the napkins the same way, but nothing changed. The silence grew louder than any rejection could have been. Each day, I hoped she would touch my shoulder, hand me a note, whisper that she believed in me. Each day ended without a word. By the second week, I stopped looking at her face for answers. I told myself that if even my mother chose not to respond, then maybe I really was invisible. I did not know until many years later that she had written back. She had tried. I learned long after that my father found her reply, tore it to pieces, and warned her not to encourage me. At the time, though, none of that mattered, because all I felt was abandonment. I carried that silence like a stone in my chest, too heavy to put down. It was easier to believe she had chosen not to see me than to imagine a hidden battle I could not witness. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I stopped trying to win affection. I no longer left my papers out on the table or rushed to share good grades. I learned that silence is not neutral. It is a kind of answer, and it taught me to expect nothing, even from the people who should have given me everything. When you are young, you think anger is the sharpest wound, but I learned that indifference leaves deeper scars because it leaves you alone with your questions. Looking back now, I can see how that silence shaped the person I became. It hardened me. It told me that love was conditional, that recognition was not promised. It was the seed of the distance that grew between me and the rest of my family. I became the invisible daughter, present at every meal, every family gathering, but never really part of the story they were telling. I carried that invisibility into the years that followed, and it would push me toward choices that changed everything. The letter that went unanswered became a turning point. It was the day I stopped believing that home was the place I would ever find myself. In the years that followed, I stayed, but only because I had nowhere else to go. I finished school, I tried to keep my head down, and for a time I worked at Monroe Tech, hoping that maybe if I proved myself in the company, I might finally earn a place in the family. But my father's patience ran thin. Every meeting where I spoke was cut short. Every idea I offered was dismissed until one evening he called me into his office. He did not ask me to sit. He said plainly that I was no longer welcome. He told me I should find another path, that my presence was a distraction. Then he signalled for security, and they walked me out with a small box in my arms. I had done nothing wrong. My only mistake was being his daughter, without fitting his mould. That walk down the hallway felt longer than any road I would ever take. I was not just leaving a job, I was being erased. That night, I packed a single suitcase from the house where I grew up. I moved slowly through my room, past the shelves of trophies. No one cared about the worn notebooks filled with my sketches and codes. I chose what I could carry and left the rest. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. My mother watched from the doorway but said nothing. Her hands folded in front of her as always. Madison and Chloe stayed upstairs. The silence in that house was louder than any words they could have spoken. When I closed the door behind me, I knew I would never walk through it as a daughter again. I found a small garage apartment at the back of a tired duplex on the other side of town. The roof leaked when it rained, and in the winter, the air inside was so cold I could see my breath. There was one outlet, a thin mattress on the floor, and a single window that looked onto a chain-link fence. But for the first time, it was mine. No rules, no sharp words, no comparisons at every meal. Just the sound of dripping water when it stormed and the hum of my own thoughts. I took a job in a warehouse moving boxes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work was heavy and my muscles ached, but the paycheck kept the lights on. At night, I came home, peeled off my boots, and sat on the floor with my laptop. The glow of the screen lit the small room like a lantern. Some nights I typed until my fingers cramped, not because anyone asked me to, but because it gave me a reason to believe there might be more than this. I lived on instant noodles and black coffee, and when the heater broke, I built a small unit out of scraps just to keep warm. My life looked nothing like the polished dinners at the estate. I thought often about the contrast. My family still sat under chandeliers, glasses, clinking laughter floating over the table, and I sat alone wrapped in 2 coats coding in the dark. The silence was crushing at times, but there was something else in it too. It was mine. For the first time in my life, the quiet belonged to me and no one could take it away. I did not feel strong. Most nights I felt only exhaustion. My body was sore, my heart was heavy, and the loneliness gnawed at me. But in that broken place, a fragile determination began to take root. If I had been cut off from everything I thought I needed, then I would have to build something new from nothing. I did not know what it would become. I only knew that I had to keep going. I remember one night in particular. The air was so cold that mist rose with every breath. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, the laptop balanced in front of me. The screen glowed against the dark walls, and for a moment, it looked like the only light left in my world. I whispered to myself not a promise, not even a plan, just a simple truth. I said, "This is all I have, but it is mine, and from here I will begin again." I had nothing left but a suitcase, a leaking roof, and a screen that lit my face in the dark. It was not much, but it was mine, and from there I would have to build everything. I remember whispering to myself in that moment, almost afraid to say it out loud, "I will start again." From nothing. It sounded fragile, like a child's promise, but inside me It became the first spark of fire. I threw myself into my work. Every free hour after long shifts at the warehouse went into my laptop. My fingers tapped until they ached. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I kept going. I was building something I believed in, a system that could track supplies, predict shortages, make operations smoother. It was not glamorous, but it was practical, and I knew it had value. For a brief moment, it seemed like the world might finally listen. A small investor showed interest. He praised my idea, told me he believed in me, even promised seed funding. He signed papers, posed for photos, spoke to me as if I had finally found a partner who saw what I could do. I let myself hope. But when the time came to move forward, he vanished. The bank transfers never arrived. The phone calls went unanswered. The man I trusted disappeared with what little I had left. Just as the first server went live, the floor dropped beneath me. My account slid below zero, my rent slipped out of reach, and the small flame of hope almost died out. I still remember the night I stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror in that cold garage. My face was pale, my body thin, my eyes hollow from long days and longer nights. I did not see brilliance. I saw someone the world had already forgotten. I gripped the edge of the sink, my hands trembling, and whispered again, but this time with a voice that felt harder, colder, stronger. I will build this again, and this time no one will stop me. That night was a turning point. I realised that if I kept showing up as Kate Morgan, I would always be the invisible daughter, the outcast my father had cast aside. I needed to become someone else, someone sharper, stronger, untouchable. I chose a name, Eliza Stone. Eliza carried a sound that was assertive, and Stone felt immovable. It was not just a name, it was armour. From that moment on, I was no longer Kate begging to be seen. I was Eliza building something no one could take away. Of course, creating a new identity was not as simple as speaking it aloud. I knew if my father ever heard whispers of what I was building, he would do everything to crush it. So I took precautions. With the little I had, I hired a law firm that specialised in shielding people like me. They created layers of protection offshore structures in Delaware, and beyond, trusts and companies within companies. On paper, there was no Kate Morgan, only Eliza Stone. To the outside world, I became a shadow no one could trace. It gave me a strange kind of freedom. I could build without fear of my father's disapproval. I could negotiate without someone laughing at my family name. I could be seen for the strength of my work, not dismissed for the sound of who I was. And so I started again. I rebuilt the system from the ground up, leaner, cleaner, faster. Each line of code felt like a step forward, not away from the past, but towards something I could finally call my own. I worked in silence, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the simple truth that this time it had to work. I had been erased, betrayed, and abandoned, but I would not let that be the end of my story. Looking back now, I see that the betrayal that nearly broke me was also the moment that forged me. If the conman had not taken what little I had, I might never have chosen to become Eliza Stone. I might never have understood the power of starting again with nothing but fire in the night to guide me. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was Eliza Stone, and I would build a world where my father's voice could never reach me. In the months that followed, I learned the power of working in silence. If I could not win in the light, I would win in the dark, and no one would see it coming. I started small, buying pieces of companies no one else cared about. A warehouse here, a packaging plant, there quiet acquisitions that never made headlines. These businesses were overlooked, but I knew they held the bones of supply chains. I brought in my software, made their systems run faster, cheaper, more reliable. Soon enough, larger clients began to depend on them without realising they were depending on me. It was slow work, but Steady. I took no shortcuts. Every time I signed a deal under the name Eliza Stone, I reminded myself that Kate Morgan had been dismissed, but Eliza was untouchable. And then something remarkable happened. Monroe Tech itself began to notice improvements in its suppliers. Costs went down, delivery times improved. My father and his executives toasted themselves for making good choices, never realizing those choices were already mine. The irony gave me a quiet satisfaction. They had told me I was never useful, and yet now they were unknowingly leaning on me for their survival. Around this time, Chloe married Kyle Anderson. He was eager, ambitious, but careless. My father, proud of his new son-in-law, gave him a shiny promotion inside Monroe Tech. He was placed in charge of strategic partnerships and given the authority to sign supplier contracts. In truth, my father never saw Kyle as a leader. He saw him as a pawn, a face to parade around, while he held the real strings. But that decision created an opening I could not have planned better myself. Kyle wanted badly to prove himself. He signed contracts quickly sometimes without even reading the fine print, and many of those contracts were with Everest Holdings and its affiliates, believing he had scored exclusive deals. Each signature tied Monroe Tech tighter to me, and each time he bragged about impressing my father, I stayed in the shadows and let him. What he thought were his victories were mine. Then I noticed something else. The contracts began to show irregularities. Kyle started requesting consulting fees. Small percentages slipped into side agreements, routed into accounts he controlled. At first I considered cutting him off, but then I realized there was no need. Sometimes the best way to expose a weakness is to let it reveal itself. So I approved the requests, not because I respected him, but because I knew the more rope he had, the more likely he was to hang himself. Month by month, Monroe Tech became more dependent on Everest. Their warehouses ran on my software. Their logistics relied on my upgrades. Their partnerships were increasingly tied to contracts Kyle himself had signed with me. And through it all, they never looked behind the curtain. To them, I was Eliza Stone, an unknown player in the market, one of many. To me, I was weaving a net so tight that one day they would wake up and realize they were already inside it. At night, I would sit in my office and look at the map of connections, each line showing another company, another supplier, another contract under my control. It was not just numbers on a screen. It was proof that the daughter they had erased was building an empire around them, quietly, deliberately, and with precision they never thought me capable of. I felt stronger than I ever had before, not because the world recognized me, but because they did not. The less they saw, the more I grew. Looking back, I see now how much my father's arrogance worked in my favor. He trusted Kyle too much, believed too deeply in his own control, and never imagined that the very man he put forward as a symbol of family success would be the one opening the door to me. Every contract Kyle signed, every deal he celebrated was not proof of his rise. It was proof that Monroe Tech was already mine. And the best part was, my family had no idea. Then, one afternoon, a cream-coloured envelope arrived, heavy paper, with gold trim, my name written in stiff script. I held it in my hands for a long moment before opening it. Inside was Chloe's wedding invitation. Kate Morgan, it read, not Eliza Stone, not the woman I had become, but the forgotten daughter they still believed I was. There was no warmth in the words, no personal message, only formal language asking me to attend. Tucked behind it was a smaller card. You are welcome at the ceremony, it said, but seating at the dinner is limited. Limited. I knew what that meant. I was not family. I was a formality, a name they included for appearance, nothing more. For years, I had been erased from their story, and now, suddenly, I was invited to play a part again. It felt less like a welcome and more like a reminder of where they thought I belonged. At the edge, silent and unseen. Holding that card, I felt old wounds tear open. I remembered the last time I saw Chloe, her laugh at my expense, her words about people who peaked in high school, her smirk as though my life had ended before it began. Now, she wanted me there, not as a sister, but as a shadow to make her day look whole. At first I thought about throwing the invitation away. Let them keep their perfect pictures without me. Let them believe I was too wounded to show up. But then I saw something else. Around that same time, I received word that Monroe Tech's board was preparing to finalise a sale. The name Everest appeared in their legal drafts. My Everest, my work, my hand behind the curtain. Suddenly, the wedding was not only an invitation, it was an opportunity, an opening to step back into their world, not as the failure they thought they had cast aside, but as the owner they never imagined I had become. I decided I would go. Not to play their part, not to make peace, but to see their faces when truth finally broke through the glass they had hidden behind for so long. When the day arrived, I came early, not out of excitement, but because I wanted to see the place to measure the stage where this old story would meet its end. The venue was extravagant, every detail, polished, every flower chosen to show wealth and perfection. It was exactly what Chloe would want a magazine spread come to life. As I stood near the back garden, Chloe appeared. She looked radiant, her gown fitted like a dream, her smile practiced for the cameras. She moved close to me, her hands clasped tight, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "I'm glad you came," she said, and then her smile faltered just slightly. "But please, don't ruin my day." The words hung between us. She said them like a plea, but also a warning. She wanted me silent, invisible, as I had always been. I looked at her at the flicker of worry behind her eyes, and I said nothing. I let her twist her hands and return to her stage. Inside, I was torn. Part of me wanted to leave, to walk away again, to prove I no longer needed them. But another part of me burned with anticipation. They had never let me sit at their table. They had left me at the edge of every room, unacknowledged and unwanted. And now they had placed me far away again at the back, as if distance could erase me once more. What they did not know was that distance no longer mattered. I did not need their table. The truth was, the table itself was already mine. But that night, as I walked into the reception hall, no one else knew it. The chandeliers glowed above us, casting gold light across polished floors and silk-draped tables. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne. Everything looked perfect, as if the evening had been staged for a magazine spread. But I knew that beneath the glitter there was a deeper story waiting to break. They had placed me at a table on the far edge of the room. From there I could see the head table clearly, but I was far enough away that my presence felt like an afterthought. I knew it was no mistake. They wanted me close enough to be seen, but far enough to remind me of my place. I looked at my sisters, laughing in the glow of the chandeliers, my mother smoothing the folds of her napkin, my father sitting tall at the centre. Around me, whispers rose and fell. A few polite smiles were sent my way, but most people glanced at me quickly, then looked back to the stage of the family where I no longer belonged. The toasts began. First, the best man who told stories of college pranks. The room filled with laughter. Then, a family friend stood offering compliments about Chloe's kindness and beauty. Chloe beamed, and Kyle squeezed her hand as though he had won the prize of his life. It was polished, rehearsed, predictable. I sipped my champagne and waited, knowing the real speech was still to come. When my father rose to speak, the room fell silent. He had always commanded attention with little effort. His voice carried weight, his presence demanded stillness. He lifted his glass and spoke of legacy of love, of the strength of family. He praised Chloe and Kyle, calling their union the future of the Morgans. His words were heavy with pride, and the guests nodded along. Then he paused the silence long enough to draw every eye. He spoke again, his voice firm. Tonight, he said, is not only a celebration of marriage, but the start of a new chapter. Monroe Tech has been sold. $50 million. A bright future secured. The room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked, smiles stretched wide. People turned to each other, murmuring about the number, the success, the brilliance of Charles Morgan. I watched quietly, knowing what they did not. The applause died down, and he stood straighter, ready to deliver what he believed would be the final word. He spoke of inheritance. He named Chloe and Kyle, saying they were taken care of. He mentioned Madison, praised her place in the family, assured her future was secure. And then he turned his eyes toward me, his tone sharp but steady. As for Kate, he said she will be receiving nothing. The words landed like a stone dropped into water. At first there was only silence, and then it came. A wave of laughter, soft at first, then louder, rippling across the room. Some smiled with pity, others with satisfaction. Madison smirked behind her glass. Chloe shifted in her seat, eyes down. My mother looked at her lap, her hands folded tighter. And I sat, still, glass in hand, my heart steady. I should have felt humiliated. Years earlier I might have. But not anymore. I had already walked out of that house. I had already faced the nights alone in a freezing garage built from nothing, rebuilt again after betrayal. I had already chosen a new name, a new life, a new empire. So, when the laughter came, I did not bend. I did not flinch. I let them laugh, because the truth was mine to hold, and I knew what was coming. I looked at my father, standing tall and proud, believing he had erased me once more. I looked at the guests, their eyes sparkling with amusement, at the forgotten daughter who would inherit nothing. And I smiled to myself, because this time the story would not end with his words. They thought they had written the final line of my life. What they did not know was that the real story had not even begun. I stood, the glass steady in my hand, and the room went quiet in that instant, the way a room goes quiet when something important is about to happen. I met my father's eyes and spoke clearly so every word would carry. You said you sold Monroe Tech to Everest Holdings. Then allow me to offer my congratulations to myself. Because I am Everest Holdings. The air shifted. A few guests gasped. Someone dropped a fork. Phones came up. Faces turned, and the laughter that had washed over me a moment ago vanished as if it had never been there. My mother stared at me with her lips parted as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Madison's smile froze and slipped. Chloe's face went pale. My father blinked once, then twice, and for the first time in years, I saw something on his face I had never seen before. Fear. He recovered quickly and straightened his shoulders, the old pride returning to his voice. He said I was lying. He said there was a clause in the agreement, a condition that would void the sale the moment my identity was tied to the buyer. He called it a safeguard. He called it smart business. Then he lifted a sheaf of papers from the head table and held them up like a trophy. The clause is right here, he said. This deal is dead on arrival. A murmur ran through the guests, a ripple of doubt and curiosity. He was counting on that doubt. He always had. He had spent a lifetime turning rooms to his side with a steady tone and a straight face. He thought this night would be no different. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I set my glass down and walked forward until the glow of the chandeliers caught the edge of the folder in my hand. No, I said simply. That is not the contract that was signed. That is a draft. It was prepared to frighten me. It was never approved. What I have here is the agreement that is on public record with the authorities. Signed, sealed, final. I opened the folder and handed it to my attorney, who had been standing at the back of the room waiting for my signal. He stepped forward, spoke in a calm, even tone, and read the essential lines that confirmed control had transferred. He pointed to signatures to dates to the mark that showed the filing had been accepted. It did not take long. It did not need to. Truth rarely needs many words when the paper is clear. My father tried to interrupt, saying there had been a mistake, that he had other pages, other versions. But the weight of certainty was already moving across the room, and the old trick of speaking louder than the facts no longer worked. People leaned in to see. Some nodded. Others looked down, embarrassed for him. Chloe glanced at Kyle with a pleading question in her eyes, and he looked away. Madison stared at the documents, as if staring could bend their meaning. My mother finally raised her head and held my gaze, and I could not tell if the shine in her eyes was shock or something close to relief. I turned back to my father. "You wanted the room to believe I was nothing," I said, and for a long time I believed it too. But I built something in the dark, and you never looked for it, because you never looked for me. Now the truth is here. You sold your company to me. There was no trap, no clause, no way back. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. It pressed against the glass and the flowers and the silver. It pressed against years of dinners where I had no voice. He opened his mouth as if to argue again, then closed it. The papers in his hand suddenly looked thin. He set them down. I did not gloat. I did not need to. I spoke so only the front tables would hear, and yet somehow it felt like the whole room leaned closer. "You taught me to be useful," I said. "You just never imagined that I would be useful to myself. You told me I would get nothing. You were wrong. I have everything I need." A few guests began to clap, not loud, but enough to break the spell. Others stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. The band in the corner fell silent. Somewhere near the back, a glass clicked against a plate and then stilled. I let the quiet settle. It was the kind of quiet that comes when power moves from one set of hands to another. And then I lifted my chin and spoke once more. "There is one more matter we need to address," I said, and my eyes found Kyle across the room. "But that belongs to what comes next. Tonight, you wanted the world to see me as nothing. What they have seen instead is the truth. I am Everest Holdings, and I am not invisible anymore." The room was still holding its breath when I lifted my hand and said there was one more truth we needed to face. This was not about a contract or a title now. This was about what had been done in the dark while everyone smiled in the light. I turned toward Kyle. He sat very straight, his jaw tight, his eyes darting from me to my father, and back again. I spoke his name, and the sound of it seemed to echo. I said that over many months money had moved through the very contracts he had signed. Not once, not twice, but again and again. I said that my team had gathered the records. Dates, amounts, notes, the kind of details that do not bend under pressure. I named the consulting fees that did not make sense. The small changes in agreements that grew into large payments to accounts that were not part of any real work. A screen lit behind the head table. Pages appeared one after another, not to overwhelm, only to make it plain. A line of payment here, a message there, a pattern nobody could mistake. The room shifted from curiosity to alarm. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Someone whispered that this could not be true. Chloe leaned forward and gripped the edge of the table, as if she needed to hold on to something solid. I kept going steady and clear. I said the money did not stop in the accounts tied to Kyle. It moved on. It reached a private fund controlled by Lena Foster. And those transfers were not an accident or a clerical error. They followed written approvals from within the family circle. My father spoke up then, loud and certain, saying it was a lie, a trick, a misunderstanding made to embarrass them on a day of joy. He called me cruel. He called me jealous. He said Kyle must have acted alone if anything had happened at all. He told the room he would never have allowed such a thing. But the paper did not care about pride. I asked my attorney to read a short passage from an internal note. It was brief and to the point. It approved an adjustment described as goodwill for advisory support, and it bore the initials of the man who had just sworn he knew nothing. The note did not shout or accuse. It only sat there on the screen, quiet and devastating. Kyle pushed back his chair and stood. He said it was not what it looked like. He said he had done what he was told. He said the fees were normal. He looked at Chloe and begged her to believe him. She tried to speak, but only a broken sound came out at first. When she found her voice, it was small and strained. She asked him to tell her it was not true. He could not. He turned to my father then and said he had followed his lead, that every step had been approved, that he had been told, "This is how business is done." My father raised a shaking hand and called him a liar. He said he had never seen those details, that this was an ambush, that I had planned it to ruin them. But the line of transfers stayed on the screen. The messages stayed. The note with his mark stayed. The room no longer moved with him. He tried to grab the story, but it slipped from his hands. Madison stood and told me I was tearing the family apart. She said there were better ways, private ways, quiet ways. I looked at her and said I had tried quiet for a lifetime, and it had only taught them to be careless. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke to the room, but I also spoke to Chloe. I told her that I did not come to humiliate her. I came because truth has a right to be spoken when lies have been used to keep others in their place. I told her that Kyle was not the mastermind. He was a door that others had used. I turned then just enough to let the meaning fall where it should. This was a pattern shaped by Lena and protected by a man who wanted to keep his hands clean while other people carried the risk. The guests did not laugh now. Some stared at their plates. Some stared at my father. A few looked at me with something like respect, as if they could finally see the thread that had been woven under their noses. Chloe wiped her eyes and stood. She did not shout. She did not perform. She only asked Kyle if he would face what he had done and make it right. He could not give her that. And in that small failure, I watched something inside her close. My mother, who had been silent for so long, lifted her head and looked from me to my father and back again. I saw that she understood, maybe for the first time, that silence protects the wrong people. My father started to speak again, reaching for the old power in his voice, but the room did not bend. His words hit the air and fell. I took a breath, steady and full, and I said that this is what happens when someone uses pawns and thinks no one will ever see the hands behind them. Pawns are easy to move until the board changes. Tonight, the board has changed. The weight of that truth settled on the tables and the flowers and the sparkling glass. It was heavy and it was real. I did not ask for apologies. I did not need confessions. I only asked for what should have been asked long ago. Accountability. Chloe sat down slowly and folded her hands in her lap. She looked young and older at once. She whispered almost to herself that this was not the day she had planned. I told her no, it was not. But it might be the day she begins to tell her own story with both eyes open. I let the screen go dark. The papers were gathered. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the hush of fear, the hush of seeing clearly. I had spoken what needed to be spoken, and nothing would be the same. I woke the next morning to headlines that carried my name like a bright flare, and for a brief hour the world seemed to cheer the woman who stood up in a room that had once silenced her. Then the wind turned. Rumours spread like a stain across the day, and by noon the calls began. Reporters asked if I had used dirty money. Traders asked if I was about to fall. Board members asked for an emergency meeting. I knew at once whose hands were on the rope. My father and Lena had left the ballroom behind and moved the fight to the one place where whispers can drown out truth if they are sharp enough. The market. They did not invent a lie. That would have been too easy to cut down. They twisted a memory I had tried to bury. Years earlier at my lowest, a man had promised me seed money. He smiled, he posed for photos he signed, and then he vanished, taking what little I had. I cut him off and rebuilt from nothing. That part was true. But the story that spread said something else. It said Everest was born from that money, that the foundation of everything I had made was tainted. It was a half-truth wrapped around my throat like a thin wire. My phone lit up with messages that piled on top of each other. Have you seen this? We need a statement. Are you going to resign? I sat at my desk and watched our stock shudder on the screen, watched it drop in a way that made the room feel smaller. Panic travels fast when people want a reason to doubt. The very people who had called me a genius yesterday wanted a guarantee today, and when I could not hand it to them in a single sentence, they turned. I could hear Lena in the shape of the words. I could hear my father in the timing. He always loved a public stage. This time he had found a bigger one. Chloe called first. Her voice was thin but steady. She said she did not understand the numbers, but she believed me. She said she was sorry for not seeing what stood in front of her for so many years, and that if I needed her to speak, she would. I thanked her and told her that her voice mattered more than she knew, but that this fight had to be mine. After we hung up, my mother left a message. She does not often call. In a quiet voice, she said that sometimes truth takes longer than we want, and that she was here if I needed her. It was only a few words, but for a woman who had mastered silence, it felt like a door cracking open. Then the board called. They spoke carefully, as people do when they want to sound calm while counting exits. They asked about the rumours about the old investor, about my plan to steady the company. Some of them were loyal, some of them were frightened. A few asked if perhaps a different face at the head would ease the storm. I felt the old hurt rise, the familiar feeling of being pushed to the edge of the room, and for one heartbeat I wanted to shout. Instead, I said we would meet that evening. I asked for a few hours. They gave me less than I needed. When the line went dead, I stood in front of the window and let the chill of the glass steady me. Doubt crept in, quiet and sure. I had spent so much time fighting ghosts from my childhood that I had not seen how quickly the outside world could turn. I had believed that if I worked in silence and won with results, the truth would protect me. But truth without proof is a whisper in a storm, and half-truths told loudly can sound like a verdict. I closed my eyes and saw the cold garage where I once watched my breath float in the air. I remembered the night I promised to build again, when everything was gone. That promise had not been made to applause or headlines. It had been made in the dark to myself, with no one to hear it. I opened my eyes and called my team. We would not answer with noise. We would answer with light. I told them to gather every record from the early days to now. Contracts, bank letters, cancelled checks, the paper trail of a life built from nothing but work. No spin, no grand words, clear proof. I told them to prepare a live address for the evening and to invite the press, the board, and anyone who cared enough to listen. One of my advisors urged caution. He said a statement might be safer. He said doing it live was a risk. I said silence had been a risk my whole life. I would not repeat it now. As the afternoon wore on, more stories appeared, each one bending the truth a little further, each one cut to fit the shape my father wanted. Orion stepped in with quotes about trust and stability, wearing the careful smile of a rival who smells blood. I could feel the net tightening, But I also felt something I had not felt since the night I became Eliza Stone. Resolve. I was not a child at a family table waiting for permission to speak. I was a woman who had built a company piece by piece with work and will, and I would not hand it over to men who thought they could win by pointing at smoke and calling it fire. In the late afternoon, Chloe sent me a short note. "Whatever happens, I am with you." A few minutes later, my mother sent a photo of a folded paper. I knew at once. My old letter. The one I had written when I was young, asking if she believed in me. Her message said only this: I should have answered sooner. I am answering now. I put the phone down and let myself feel it for one breath. Then I went back to work. When the meeting time came, I walked into the boardroom, holding a thin stack of papers, and looked at the faces around the table. Some anxious, some angry, all waiting. I told them we would stand in front of the world tonight and show what needed to be shown. Not for drama, for clarity. I said that if they wanted a leader who hid in quiet rooms, they had picked the wrong woman. If they wanted a leader who would meet a storm with truth, they could walk with me. I could not promise that the stock would rise tomorrow. I could promise that we would not run. The room shifted, not enough to call it support, enough to buy a little time. When I left, the sky outside had darkened. The city lights blinked awake one by one, and I felt the old fear and the new strength standing together inside me. I had been thrown into a second valley. Fine. I would climb out again. I called my team and told them we would not hide behind a statement or wait for the storm to pass. We would face it. We would speak clearly and show what needed to be shown. I reminded them that months ago, long before anyone whispered about dirty money, I had ordered a full independent review of our earliest days and every year since, not because I feared an attack, but because I knew one would come. The files were ready. The audit was clean. The proof was there. We set up a live address for that evening and opened the line to anyone who wanted to watch board members, shareholders, reporters, and people who were simply curious to see if I would break. When the camera light came on, I did not make a speech about my character or my pain. I laid out a trail that a child could follow. Here is the seed money that actually built the first version of our work. Here are the cancelled checks. Here are the bank letters. Here is the date the con man disappeared, and here is the date I rebuilt without him. Here are the contracts that funded the real beginning. Here is the ledger that shows how every dollar was earned. We posted the documents in real time, each page visible, each number explained. I did not rush. I let the truth breathe. I told the viewers that silence had nearly ruined my life once, and I would not let it ruin my company. I said I would answer every question with paper, and where the paper could not speak, I would. The chat moved fast, but the tone shifted as the minutes passed. Analysts who had sounded doubtful in the morning began to admit that what they were seeing was rare. A few called it the cleanest window into a private company they had ever watched. The stock did not bounce back in a single breath, but it stopped falling. That was enough for the moment. After the stream ended, the room around me exhaled, but I knew the night was not done. A courier arrived with a plain envelope, no return name. Inside were copies of internal memos from Monroe Tech, signed approvals that tied my father to the very side deals he had called a misunderstanding. The last page showed a transfer that could only have cleared with his blessing. There was a small, sticky note without a signature. It read simply, "Use this." I did not need a name to know who had sent it. Madison had always been quick and sharp. She had also learned to survive by standing close to our father. Now, for the first time, she had taken one step away. I placed the papers in a folder marked with tonight's date. A minute later, Chloe called and asked if she could speak on the record. Her voice was steadier than it had been the day before. She said she wanted to tell people what she had seen with her own eyes. She wanted to say that I had not come to her wedding to break anything, but to tell the truth that others had tried to hide. I told her yes. She spoke to a reporter soon after, and the clip travelled fast, not because it was dramatic, but because it sounded simple and true. Then my mother came to my office. She looked small in the doorway, at first the way a person looks when they are learning to do something new with their hands. She held a folded paper that I recognised the moment I saw the edge. It was my letter from years ago, the one where I asked if she believed in me and begged her to speak. She said she'd written back that he tore it up, that she let fear do the speaking for her after that. She said she could not go back and answer me as a girl, but she could answer me now. She placed the letter in my palm and closed my fingers around it. I wanted to be angry, but what I felt was a quiet I had never known. She sat beside me and said, "I will speak if you ask me to." I told her she already had. We watched the markets flicker on the screen in silence for a moment, and then I walked her to the door. Before she left, she paused and pressed my hand once like a promise. When the board gathered that night, I brought only 2 things into the room: the audit I had shown the world and the small folder Madison had sent. I told them that trust is not built with slogans, it is built with proof. I reminded them that I had anticipated this attack for months and prepared, not because I doubted our work, but because I understood the people who would try to break it. I said I would stand in front of any camera and any courtroom with the same papers I had placed in front of them now. And then I told them what they had not yet seen, the memos that linked my father to the shadow deals and to Lena's fund. The table went quiet. Some faces softened, a few hardened. 1 or 2 still looked for a way to step back from me without looking cowardly. I did not chase them. I said the company would weather this, not because of faith in me, but because of facts. I asked them to stay or to go, but not to waver. When I finished, there were no cheers. There was only a sense that the ground was still, at least for now. As I left the room, my phone buzzed once more. A message from Chloe with a single line. "I am proud of you." I stood alone in the hall and let the words reach the places that had been dark for too long. Then I walked back to my office and turned on the light. The second valley had not vanished, but the climb had begun. I had answered with proof. I had allies I never expected, and for the first time in years, the silence was mine to break. I walked into the boardroom with a steady breath and a clear head, not as the daughter who once stood at the edge of a room waiting to be noticed, but as the woman who would begin the meeting and decide when it would end. The long table was polished, the chairs aligned, the city light spilling across the glass. Faces turned toward me, some expectant, some cautious, but none of them owned this space more than I did. I took the head seat without ceremony. No one objected. The room accepted it the way a room accepts daylight when the blinds are raised. I placed a single folded paper on the table in front of me. It was the letter I wrote to my mother when I was young, the one that asked if she believed in me. For years it had lived as a wound. Now it lay here as a marker not of pain but of passage. I smoothed the crease with my fingers and lifted my eyes to the board. "Thank you for being here," I said. "We have weathered a storm none of us invited, and we are still standing. That matters." Before we begin, I want to be clear about what kind of table this is. I do not ask for a seat anymore. I choose who sits here. There was no applause, only a quiet shift in posture around the room, a release of breath, a lifting of chins. The work could begin. I outlined the path forward with simple promises. We will run this company with open books and steady hands. We will earn trust with proof, not slogans. We will protect the people who build our value and hold accountable the people who try to strip it. I said there would be no more back doors, no more whispered exceptions, No more favors traded in the dark. Every voice here would be heard, but decisions would be made with the same measure for everyone. No one is above the rules that keep us honest. No one is beneath the respect that keeps us whole. I looked to the end of the table where Chloe sat among the junior staff. She had started her trial role a few days earlier, quiet on time, eyes open. I told the room that she would stay where she was, for now that her work would be reviewed by a manager who did not share our last name, that her future here would depend only on the value she brings. I saw the flicker of relief on her face, not because I had protected her, but because I had not. She wanted a fair chance. She would get one. I turned to the directors who had stood firm during the worst of the talk and thanked them. Then to the ones who had wavered. I told them I understood fear. I also told them that fear would not be our compass again. If you stay, I said, stay to build. If you go, go with respect. But do not stand in the door and block the light. We approved a series of steps that would anchor the company after the storm. A permanent transparency portal for shareholders. A standing independent audit every year. A code of conduct that covered not just crimes, but the small habits that breed them. We did not dress it up. We wrote it down and we signed it. As the papers moved around the table, I felt the old shadows lift the ones that once told me I needed permission to exist. I had already taken the head seat, but this was different. This was a room learning to stand with me, not because I demanded it, but because the work demanded it. Eleanor was present, her posture careful, her eyes steady. She did not speak. She did not need to. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod that said, more than any speech could have, I am here and I am not afraid of my voice anymore. Madison did not join the company, and I did not ask her to. She stood in the doorway for a moment and met my gaze with a look that carried both apology and defiance. I thanked her for the documents she sent when it mattered. She nodded once and left. It was enough for now. As for my father, his chair was empty and would remain so. Let absence be his final statement. We closed the agenda, and I did not rush to stand. I let the room breathe. I looked at the faces that would carry this work forward, and felt a calm that I had never known in any family room, a calm that came from earned ground. When I finally rose, I placed my hand on the folded letter once more. For a long time, I thought this paper held the question that defined me. Now, I see it held the answer I was always meant to become. I lifted it for the room to see, and spoke the last words I needed to say. This company will be led by the truth we prove, and the fairness we practice. If you sit at this table, you sit here to serve that truth. Years ago, I begged for a place. Today, I build the place and I decide who belongs. And I will never forget the cost of that. After the meeting, the room did not empty in a rush. People stayed to speak with one another, to compare notes, to set small tasks in motion. It was the sound of a future beginning, not a battle ending. Chloe walked up a little uncertain and asked if she should come by tomorrow before 8. I told her to come at 7:30 and bring a notebook. She smiled in a way that felt new, not like a picture, but like a choice. When she stepped away, my mother came to stand beside me, close but not clinging. We did not talk about the past. We did not need to. She touched the back of my hand, then turned to go. I looked out the window at the pale strip of sky between the buildings and thought of the gorge where the cold air once made my breath visible. I thought of a wedding hall where laughter tried to erase me. I thought of the first time I said I will start again from nothing. And then I thought of this table, this room, this day, and knew at last that my story was no longer framed by what they denied me, but by what I had chosen to build. It was never about revenge. It was about justice and worth and telling the truth out loud until it belonged to me. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. The boardroom door opened and the work began. But even as the papers shuffled and voices rose, I felt a stillness inside me, a stillness I had chased for years. And I want to tell you this because maybe you have carried your own silence, the kind that presses down and tells you that you are less than you are. Pain like that can shape us, but it does not have to define us. I learned that healing does not come in one grand moment of victory, but in the quiet steps we take toward ourselves. For me, it was writing code in a freezing garage. It was learning to speak when no one wanted to listen. It was daring to place an old letter on a new table. For you, it may look different. Some people find healing in small, daily rituals like walking at sunrise or writing in a journal. Some find it in prayer or meditation, letting stillness carry the weight for a while. Others find it in conversations with those who finally listen, or in the courage to seek help from a therapist who holds space without judgment. There is no single path. There is only the path you build one choice at a time until one day you look back and realize the silence no longer owns you. If you carry hurt, I want you to know you are not alone and you are not invisible. What has been denied you does not erase your worth. You can start again even from nothing, and in time you will see that the table you long to sit at may one day be the table you create. Thank you for sharing this journey with me, for listening not just to my voice, but to the echoes of your own. If this story gave you comfort or strength, I invite you to stay close to hear the next story when it comes. You can subscribe here not as a duty, but as a choice to keep walking together. Because these stories are not only mine, they are for all of us who have known silence and who are ready at last to speak.